folding.
There it is. Everyone see that? What?
Yes.
Yep.
He's got it.
Wow.
Yeah, we're in here too. Yeah, look at that. Which?
On the port. This is the port. Port going through there. Nothing really. Right,
And Andrew, what layer is the red is in what layer?
they're both Nuar.
The blue. Okay, which component?
This is the Havasu member, and that's the Gateway member, the Nuar.
Okay.
Where'd he go? Where'd he go? I'm watching. Where'd he go?
Hey, buddy.
No, they've got to go all the way to the end of the Grand Canyon to Lake Mead.
100 miles.
So they got, yeah, another 90 miles to go after we're done, and that's our 4-day trip typically, is that stretch of the river. So they will take the boats, they'll go down a little ways, and then eventually they'll take off those big side tubes. They'll take off all 4 of those pontoons on the side, they'll roll them up, or they'll deflate them, roll them up like a big cannoli, put them on the boat, link the boats together in the middle, and then power down as fast as they can to get out of that lower 90 miles out of the canyon. High water might actually help.
They're thinking of not taking the tubes off because of the high water.
That's, oh, they might, yeah, okay. So maybe they won't do the side tubes this time, but...
Because they don't have another trip planned.
What's that?
They don't have another trip that's going to get on.
No, they don't do an exchange on the 9-day trip. So they'll get on down. At 6 o'clock in the morning, there'll be a trailer waiting for those boats. They'll get those on back to Flagstaff. take everything off the boats, all the boxes, de-rig everything, clean it, spray it, repack, and relaunch another trip in a couple days. Whew, it's a busy life. It may not be the same people,
Yeah.
but I know some of them do have some turnaround trips.
Those boats are worth $250,000 each, isn't it?
Yeah. My next trip actually a week and a half.
$250,000 each for each boat, so they've got to make them work.
Gotta make it work.
That
Yeah,
one
so-
motor needs a overhaul.
Now that'll get fixed up
They
pretty
got
quick.
lots of spare motors.
That's one going on.
Yeah. So some of them do have a turnaround trip. In fact, Walt is turning around pretty quick after this, because I'm on a 4-day trip with Walt in about a week and a half after we get out of here. So he'll be meeting us at the same place we helicopter out. I'll say goodbye to Walt, helicopter up, and then a week and a half later I'll helicopter down and say hi to him again. So,
Do we camp tomorrow night?
no, we're not going to be camping at the helicopter pad tomorrow night. We'll be camping a little ways upstream, just a few minutes upstream, most likely without any white water between there. So we'll figure out how that's going to work exactly. It may change a couple things up because of the water flow. But we'll be camping upstream, and then there's another river company, Hatch, which will be going out first, and then we're going to be second out on the helicopter.
8:20, Joe said.
Yes, 8:20 will be our flight time typically.
8:20.
Yeah, we're gonna have an early morning. It'll be busted camp up pretty early. They'll probably do coffee around 4:30, maybe 5. We'll get up, we'll get going, we'll get stuff going, and it's only 5. I'm guessing 5. I don't know. We've been doing it around that time anyways.
Yeah,
So, you know what?
we're meant to be at the helipad by 8:20.
Yeah. Any other questions about that?
And we don't know whether it'll be one helicopter or two.
Hopefully with 2.
Yeah.
Hoping.
Makes
Go
it,
faster that way.
yeah.
Are you camping close to the helipad?
We're camping close to it, yeah. We're not camping at the helipad. Another river company called Hatch is camping at the helipad. We're camping 1 or 2 camps upstream from there.
So we still
Short
have-
distance.
We still have to pack up, get in the boats, and go down and get there by 8:20.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
that's-
Joe will walk us through that
Yeah.
schedule, so he'll
Yep.
walk us through and tell us all that.
You'll wear your helicopter clothes on Saturday morning to go down to the helipad.
What are helicopter clothes?
Well,
I don't know about the parachute.
no, you don't need your rain suit, in
Your
other
parachute.
words. Your parachute, that's it.
Yeah.
The clothes you want to leave the canyon in, you wear.
But make sure when you pull the ring that the chute doesn't get caught in the blades of the
Exactly.
helicopter.
Yeah.
Marty, Joe will talk us through that tomorrow evening in camp. He'll talk us through the morning routine, and so we'll have all of that information, details. Yeah.
And don't you dare try to close the door of the helicopter or open it.
Yeah.
It's made of plastic and it'll fall apart if you...
Don't even look at the helicopter wrong. Any other questions about gratuities, about anything tomorrow?
Summer question, where are we exactly today, right now?
Tuck Up Canyon.
Tuck Up Canyon.
Tuck Up Camp. About 164. Okay, well, to start us off, Shannon has already asked me 2 questions that I said I'd answer tonight. Last night I talked about the supersonic steam jets producing the rainfall for the flood in terms of taking up ocean waters. And so she asked the question, what about the waters above that are mentioned in Genesis chapter 1? Because there used to be the idea that on day 2, when God separated the waters from the water vapor canopy, that collapsed at the time of the flood. And so that was a common idea. Well, there's scientific problems with that idea that have been outlined, but there's also a huge biblical problem. First of all, the waters above are mentioned after the flood in Psalms, where the waters above are still mentioned. In other words, they still existed after the flood. Secondly, the sun, moon, and stars were put in the expanse which was between the waters. So the waters can't be above the atmosphere. It has to be beyond the sun, moon, and stars. Okay? And it says that the birds flew in the face of the expanse. So looking up, because it's all written as from a human observer on the earth, looking up The birds are flying on the face of the expanse, outer space. So where does that put the waters? At the outer limit of the universe. And Danny Faulkner, our astronomer, thought about that, and he suddenly realised molecules like water molecules, H2O, according to the amount of energy they have, according to the temperature they're at, they vibrate, they move. The hydrogen moves relative to the oxygen. And water at the outer limit of the universe vibrating would produce the equivalent of the 3 degrees cosmic microwave background that the astronomers claim is the leftover from the Big Bang. So he may be right, he may not be right, we don't know, but he's provided an explanation for the waters that automatically helps rule out the Big Bang. Now, scientifically, the problem with the vapor canopy idea is that, and Larry Vardaman did a lot of work on that. He's an atmospheric physicist that worked at the Institute for Creation Research. He did a lot of modelling on the vapor canopy, and he found that 2 problems. If you put, of course, you've got to put a lot of water up there if you're going to sustain 40 days and 40 nights of rain. If you try to put that much water up there, it's actually going to leak back down in the time before the flood, and it leaks at such a rate there'd be hardly any left by the time of the flood. And another problem is that even if it was held up there until the time of the flood, the latent heat of condensation, because it's got to turn from water vapor into rainfall, so it's got to condense, and that gives off heat. The latent heat of condensation would boil the atmosphere. So scientifically, it's a no-goer. But the primary reason is biblical. It specifically states in the text of Genesis chapter 1 that God separated the waters, and he put an expanse in between, and he put the sun, moon and stars in the expanse. So it can't be a water vapor canopy just around above the atmosphere, because the sun, moon and stars would be beyond that, and the expanse would be between the water vapor canopy and the earth. That would be just the atmosphere. It just doesn't fit the biblical description. That raises the second question that Shannon asked. What about the reference in Genesis chapter 2 that seems to imply that it might not have rained before the flood? The answer is, look at the context in Genesis chapter 2. The text says, up until the time there was a man to till the ground, there hadn't been any rain. When was there a man to till the ground? When Adam was created. Okay, as for the mist watering the face, it was the face of the garden. So there's no description in the text that would imply that there was no rainfall before the flood, because you still have evaporation. You've got the sun shining on the oceans. It's going to produce evaporation, which is going to produce clouds, which is going to produce rain, because it's going to move in off just the same water cycle that we have today. And people say, well, what about the rainbow? You know, God said to Noah, see my bow in the sky? When you see the rainbow, it'll remind you that I'm never going to send another flood again. Well, was there grape juice before Jesus had the Last Supper and bread? Yes. He just took something that already existed and gave it new meaning in the context of his crucifixion and resurrection, the shedding of his blood. This do in remembrance of me. He took something, a symbol that they're already familiar with. The same can be applied to the rainbow. When the rainbow came out, after all, at the end of the flood, as a consequence of the flood being over, God said, now see my rainbow, because it was always his rainbow. He put it there at the time of creation. My bow will from now on will be the sign that I'll never send another flood again. So we have to be careful, and I'm not criticising anyone, because part of the problem is that the Bible scholars have lagged behind the creation scientists. The creation scientists were waiting for the biblical scholars to catch up and help them understand the text better, and the creation scientists went ahead and tried to understand the text themselves, and we're finally getting some of the Old Testament and biblical scholars on board. We now have a creation theology society, and so we're finally, because you see, we scientists need, if we say that the Bible is our authority, we use the text to build our scientific models, then we need to understand the text. And we're not experts in understanding the text. We need to turn to the Bible scholars to help us to understand the text better. And so they've helped us to understand the text better in terms of these questions that I've just discussed. I'd have to remember which psalm it was. Psalm 147, I think it is. I haven't got my Bible here. Psalm 147, Psalm 143, somewhere in there. Nate will look it up. Do we have another question then while Nate's checking that out for me?
I've heard of human artifacts being found in coal mines in England. You heard of that at all?
Not in England. I've only heard of claims of artifacts being found in Pennsylvanian coal. And like a bell is claimed, but you only get to see the picture of the bell and a piece of coal. You never get the original photograph with the actual artifact entombed in the coal, etc. So that's a very difficult one. We don't know of any genuinely documented artifacts, human artifacts from the pre-flood world.
And same with footprints as well.
Yes, the same with the footprints. The only place where there was claimed of human footprints was down at the Paluxy River near Texas. And when they eroded further, they were very clearly dinosaur footprints. So it was a matter of the level of erosion that produced the shape that made them look human-like. The flip side to that, ironically, is that in the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, there are excellent human footprints that are of the order of 2.7 to 3 million years old, according to evolutionists. And they refuse to accept that they're human, even though without any, not being a specialist on human footprints, not knowing where they came from, would identify them as human footprints. So that was part of the evidence that they used to say that Lucy walked upright like a human. Oh, there's her footprints. They're genuine human footprints. And they're post-flood.
Psalm 148.
148, so I was close.
148 verse 3 and verse 4 it says, praise him, sun and moon. Praise him, all you shining stars. Praise him, you highest heavens, and you waters above the heavens.
Okay? Which is a description of above the sun, moon and stars, which is exactly in Genesis chapter 1. So the waters were still there after the flood. Another question. If I can't answer it, I'll get Nate to, because he's very knowledgeable.
List for us the universal answers. There are some layers and things that are universally found, like the great conformity. Are there other things? What other things are pretty much universally found? Evidence.
Well, there are global patterns. I wouldn't use the word universal, because that implies that they're found everywhere. But there are global patterns, okay? And I've mentioned some of those. These 6 mega sequences that are found in North America are a global pattern. It doesn't mean that every one of them is present everywhere, or the same rock units in the package as found on every continent, but it is a sequence pattern that is global. The Great Unconformity is a global distribution. Some of the fossils will follow a global pattern. So ore deposits form a global pattern. It's interesting that the major copper deposits, if you ever fly out in and out of Salt Lake City and you come in from the south, okay, on the western side of the descent or the ascent is the Bingham Canyon copper mine. It's one of the largest in the world, and you might see that big mile-high chimney by the Great Salt Lake. That's the copper smelter, originally Kennecott, but now belongs to Rio Tinto. And the Bingham Canyon is a copper mine that is similar to copper mines down in Arizona, Bisbee, Morenci, all through Yerington in Nevada, all the way up through in Montana, up through the Canadian Rockies, okay, and all the way down through the Andes. There's some huge copper mines in Peru, and particularly Chile, El Teniente, Escondido. They're huge, and they're actually in granites that were intruded at the end of the flood at the time of the subduction and plate collision. And you've got the same porphyry, we call them porphyry copper deposits. You've got them all through Iran and up in the collision zone in Tibet. You've got them as well. So there's global patterns of these things, and they tell us a lot about the processes going on in the flood. I cover some of this in my book. It was originally published in 2009 in 2 volumes with the title of Earth's Catastrophic Past, Geology, Creation and the Flood, but it's just been republished, the same text, but in 1 volume, larger format, with a new title, The Genesis Flood Revisited. I was asked to work on it by Henry Morris to be a sequel to a revision of and a sequel to the Genesis Flood book that he and Whitcomb and Morris wrote. And there's a number of chapters there on global patterns.
I bought it.
Pardon?
I bought that book, and it's a library. That's the card. Get it off of Amazon. I think someone stole it and sold it to me. Anyways, just a side note.
That's all right. Yeah, so there are these patterns. There's also patterns within the geologic record. Certain rock layers are only found in pre-flood rocks, for example. You don't see them in flood rocks or later. And so any patterns like that are clues that we need to take note of, that God could potentially have left for us, for our understanding of what was going on at different times in Earth history. But we're still unraveling all that.
Speak on the current research that you're doing.
Sorry?
You speak on the current research that you're doing in regards to radio halos and how that has changed the view on that relative to what the consensus was a few years back.
Yeah, well, there's a number of areas of research that I have worked on and am working on.
Can you repeat the question?
Jim was asking about areas of research that I've been working on and intend to work on, including radio halos. Now, they're mentioned in the Canyon Ministries book that was given to you. And the radio halos, short for radioactive halos, in granites particularly, but I have also found them in metamorphic rocks as well. And so one of the projects I've had, I've got all the data. I haven't written up the individual study, although the data will be published, Lord willing, in July at the next International Conference on Creation, the bulk data. But I'll be doing the breakdown in a separate paper. I sampled every half mile to a mile in the upper and middle granite gorges here in the canyon, the schists and the granites, and so looking for radio halos. And what you have to do is you have to take the rock, crush it, to liberate the biotite flakes, which is the black mica, and you peel it away apart till it's paper thin. Put it on a microscope slide, and what you see is that there are tiny little inclusions of zircon grains, zirconium silicate grains, trapped in the biotite. The biotite is a sheet structure, and the grain is being caught between the sheets. Well, as the uranium decays, the radioactivity is like little bullets. Alpha particles are like little bullets. And so you think of a drywall, if you fire a bullet through a drywall, what happens? You damage it. And so the radioactivity damages the crystal around the central inclusion, fires out in all three directions, so you get a spherical halo, radioactive halo. And of course, you're looking at it in section. And you can tell if it's a uranium halo because there are 8 alpha particle steps in the decay chain, and each one of those bullet steps has a different energy, so the bullets travel different distances. And so you can figure that out. Well as uranium radiohalos, the last 3 alpha particle steps are due to the decay of polonium, which is a rare metal. And you've got polonium-218, polonium-214, and polonium-210. And they're the last 3 decay steps in the uranium chain. And so, surprisingly, we find in these biotite flakes not only halos that are made from an inclusion that spits out the 8 steps of uranium to give a uranium radio halo, you find 1 and 2 and 3 ring halos that match the diameter of the polonium radioisotopes. In other words, the polonium was separate from the uranium, was separated from the uranium somehow, and independently produced its own halos. The significance of that is the half-life, the rate of decay of the polonium. For polonium-218, it's 3.18 minutes. No, 3.8 seconds. 3.8 minutes, sorry. For polonium-14, it's 164 microseconds. And for polonium-210, it's 138 days. And so, that is a mystery. Why and how would the polonium be separated to produce its own halos if it doesn't exist for very long? And so Robert Gentry, who first talked about this in the late 60s, 70s and 80s, he wrote a book in 1986. He testified at the Arkansas Creation Evolution trial, and he suggested that these were found in granites, that there was no way they could have been produced naturally, that they had to be the fingerprints of God's creation. And when the expert witness for the evolution side was put on the stand, G. Brent Dalrymple, who was at the time the Deputy Director of the US Geological Survey, when he was challenged about these halos, he said, they're a tiny mystery. He had no answer. Well, I took up this work because I got quite excited about it as a graduate student, and I was in contact with Robert Gentry, and I learnt his techniques so I could study them. Because I realised, as did my friend Kurt Wise, who's at Truett at McConnell University in Cleveland, Georgia, that some of the samples, Gentry was a physicist, and he didn't pay attention to the geological context of his samples. Because some of these samples were, one, from uranium mines, but secondly, they were from granites that were produced during the flood. And they're not creation weak granites, they're granites produced during the flood. And I investigated this further. And so, for example, I went to an area in Australia between Sydney and Melbourne, near what we call the Snowy Mountains. Yes, we have snow in Australia, yes. It's winter snow, yes. Not summer snow, winter. Anyhow, you can actually walk from fossil-bearing, flood-deposited sedimentary layers through zones of progressive, higher and higher heat and pressure produced metamorphism. So you get new minerals formed to the place where the rock finally fully melted. Oh, here we are. Fully melted to produce a granite. And so that shows you that the halos had to form after the granite formed during the flood, because the granite was derived by the melting in the middle of this regional metamorphic zone. And that's the same in other parts of the world. I've sampled granites in England, I've sampled granites in South Korea, in North America, Australia, Africa, and so I looked at this, and the answer is that the polonium radiohalos are always found in close proximity to the uranium radiohalos in the same biotite flakes usually. And I remember it was a Sunday afternoon when I was teaching at ICR. I used to go in the afternoon down to the library, one of the best geological libraries in the US, at Scripps Oceanographic Institute at La Jolla down by the coast. It was stinking hot out at El Cajon, but you go over and you go down to La Jolla and it was beautiful. And there was no one in the library. And I found in the catalogue this book on the chemistry of the rare elements. And it was actually in the main library on the main UCSD campus. So I went over there and I found it, published in 1956. And there was a whole chapter on polonium. And it turns out polonium has the same affinity as lead for sulfur. It has the same valence. And also looked at radon and radium. So what we find is that hot waters, when a granite cools, it releases hot water. The same in metamorphic rocks. The water's there from the original sediments. Water can travel down between the biotite flakes, collect. We'll have a pause in a moment, and they can get those. The idea is that the radium and radon leaks out of the zircon crystal. Hydrothermal fluids come by that are sulfur rich, pick up the polonium and deposit it nearby to produce the polonium radiohalos. But it's only possible if uranium decay was accelerated. You need to produce a lot of polonium very quickly, otherwise it would go. And so there's another one of this. We had 6 lines of evidence in the RATE project that nuclear decay had been accelerated during the flood, and the polonium and polonium radio halos was one of those evidences. And so I've continued that work off and on over the years. I've got data all through the Grand Canyon that I'll be publishing probably next year, and also from a major area in Australia. I've got a data that I'll be publishing as well. And so there's more work on radio halos coming. Let's get some food before the wind blows the sand on it. So pause now. So if you're looking for a brief description about radio halos, you'll find that in the guidebook that you're given by Nate at the beginning of the trip. They're mentioned there. One thing I will do though, I've decided is that when we're in contact with you all after the trip, I'll send you either in an email or in a Word document attached to an email some of these articles, the web addresses of the articles on the evidences for the flood, on the radio halos, on radiocarbon, on radioactive dating. I'll send those to you, and also I'll send you the links to the technical papers that have been written already on the folds, on the rocks here in the canyon. So the radio halos, you'll get that description in the handout, Canyon Ministries handout. Now another area I think I mentioned the other day is further work on radiocarbon in diamonds. Did I say that to all of you, or only one or two of you? Okay. So I mentioned that radiocarbon has been found in diamonds. Okay, and John Baumgarten and I want to follow up on that. We wanted to get more diamonds. Okay, and it's very hard to get diamonds, but there is a guy at the University of Glasgow in Scotland who is the designated research professor by De Beers for requests for diamonds for research, and he supplied them the last time during the RATE project. Well, John Baumgartner was trying to get in touch with Jeff Harris, is his name, and he couldn't raise him. He didn't know whether his email was working or what have you. So he decided to contact the number 2 diamond expert in the world, who's at the University of Alberta in Calgary. So he calls him up and explained to him that, you know, I'm trying to find Jeff Harris. Do you know whether he's retired? Have you got his phone number or his email address? And this guy said, wait a minute, he's here in my office visiting me. I'll put him on the phone. And sure enough, he said, yeah, I'll be happy to get him. So he sent us 30 more diamonds. So we've got a radiocarbon lab lined up for that in Finland. And hopefully, Lord willing, that work will go ahead shortly. Another area of research, so that actually the radiocarbon was another evidence for a young Earth. But one of the other evidences was the research that was done by Russ Humphreys with assistance from some of the rest of us, where he took zircon crystals from granite near Los Alamos, in which, ironically, Robert Gentry had looked at radio halos in the same granite. And it's a very well studied drill hole, and they recorded the temperatures at different depths. And Robert Gentry had also done work on the helium that was measured in the rocks, and the helium had leaked out of the zircon grains. And so we had experiments done on leakage of helium out at the rate of leakage of helium out of zircon grains, and it happens that it's so fast that the granite can't be 1.5 billion years old that these grains came from. Well, I always said to Russ Humphries that statistically, a sample of one isn't very good. You need to be able to verify that from other samples from other places. So for some years I've been working at getting several other samples, and we've finally got 3 other sources of zircons. One is actually from here in the Grand Canyon. I didn't have to get a permit for it because I've got leftover pieces of the ruby pluton, the ruby granodiorite. You remember we went through the jewels? We went through Ruby Rapid. Well, the rock there and at Ross Wheeler Camp, remember where you saw the boat on the shoreline? One of the samples came from that spot there. You have to be very careful about the zircons, the granite you select and the zircons, because if there's too much uranium in the zircon grains, the radioactive decay will have damaged the crystals, which affects your helium leakage measurements. And it turns out that the ruby pluton, the ruby granite, has very low uranium content in the zircons, and they gave excellent uranium lead date of 1.72 or something billion. Anyhow, so I've got those zircon grains. I've got zircon grains from, I mentioned about when I was talking about the secularists having dated a rock by more than one method and then adjusting the decay rate of one of the, from the rhyolite on the shores of Lake Superior, north of Duluth, that's got excellent zircon grains in it, and it's got a very good pedigree in the literature, so that helps. And we decided to get zircons from a young rock, and one that's well used in the literature for a number of studies is the Fish Canyon tuff, which is south of Denver, in the in a area to the south of Denver. So we've got the zircon grains separated. We now only have to hand pick the right size grains, and we have to find a laboratory. And we've contacted a number of laboratories in the US, but because they know who we are, it's almost impossible to get them to do the work, even if you pay them to do it. They don't want to do work for creationists. So be in prayer about that, because I'd love to get 3 other zircon samples replicating the results that Russ Humphries did in that area. So that's another area of research that I'm working in. I'm also involved in a group that's looking at recalibrating radiocarbon. Remember what I said about if we went to an archaeological site that we knew the exact biblical date from the text of Scripture? Well, for example, we know when the fall of Nineveh occurred, the fall of Nineveh. Okay? There were 2 guys that were buried under the rubble, and we got radiocarbon dates on their bones, and they matched the biblical date. So that's good. We've got a good data point. But what about the traditional site for Sodom and Gomorrah? If we could nail that, and we know that there was grain, for example, that was in storage jars that was preserved through the conflagration of the fiery destruction, radiocarbon, again, if it doesn't match the biblical date, you know by how much it doesn't, and you can therefore get data points from different archaeological sites of different radiocarbon dates from those sites to show how much it diverges back, and then you can go to unknown archaeological sites, get the radiocarbon date and correct it to figure out, that site fits there in the text of Scripture. So that's another area that I'm involved in. And I'm also looking at the literature of more rock types that are recorded in literature where they've dated them by more than one method to get further statistics. I'm also interested in the dating of lunar rocks. I'm also interested in craters, impact craters. Where do they fit into the text? After all, there's craters on the moon, there's craters on Venus, there's craters on Mars. Where do they fit with the craters that are found on the Earth? I believe they're all involved in the flood, even though some claim that the dating of the lunar craters goes back to 4.3 billion years. But it depends on whether those 4.3 million year dates are accurate. And so I believe that we have to do a lot of recalibration of the dates, not only here on the Earth, but on the moon, based on what was the primordial composition of the rocks when God created them. Could he have created a lot of lead as well as uranium? Why not? Why not? And the geologist comes along and assumes the lead has come from uranium decay and gives the vast ages. Why, as I said the other day, why do the meteorites from the asteroids give you the same age as the Earth? Well, actually, back up a minute. The age of the Earth was never dated by Earth rocks. Never dated by Earth rocks. Did you know that? I didn't tell you that the other night. The age of the Earth was never established by the dating of Earth rocks. It was established by the dating of meteorites. Why? Because the secular assumption is that the meteorites come from asteroids, which is leftover material from the solar nebula, the sun flinging out the material to condense to form the Earth and the planets. And so it's based on the assumption that the sun came before the Earth. Well, we know from the scriptures that's wrong. The Earth was created first and the sun later. So therefore we have to reconsider what the asteroids mean. God would have created them on day 4 when he made the sun, moon and stars. He doesn't say comets and other things, but he obviously did. He made all the heavenly bodies on day 4. So could it be that he used the same primordial material that he used to make the Earth, to make the sun, the moon and the other rocky planets and the asteroids? Yes, probably. I don't know. These are questions that we need to investigate. And so, you know, I need another couple of lifetimes to get through all this research. Chris.
I think I heard you say that you have a suspicion that the craters on the moon, maybe Venus, were created during the flood?
Correct.
What's your initial reason for suspecting that?
Well, it can't be from the creation week. You know, my colleague, bless his heart, Danny Faulkner, has the idea that the craters on the moon were formed during the creation week. But what do impact craters represent? Destruction. Impact craters on the Earth are involved in wiping out dinosaurs, for example, or contributing to dinosaurs, wiping out critters during the flood. There's a fossil site on the I-90, I think it is, in North Dakota, somewhere up there, where they've found the impact glass from the Mexican Chicxulub, Yucatan Peninsula impact was in the gills of the fish when they choked to death, suffocated. So the impacts are associated with death and destruction, and I don't see that theologically that's appropriate during the creation week. And if we're talking about meteorite impacts during the flood, then there's no reason why some of those meteorites and asteroids couldn't impact the other planets at the same time, the moon as well. And so the flood had consequences throughout the solar system. In fact, it was a surprise to the NASA scientists when they did the first flybys of Venus. they found that the impacts on Venus were less than they were expecting, and most of them were very young, and the surface of Venus is almost totally covered with basalt. And they came to the conclusion that there was a vast outpouring on Venus of basalts only in recent history. In their book, Recent History, and it would match the same time as catastrophic plate tectonics on the flood, where you also had massive outpourings of basalts. The Columbia River basalts, the Deccan traps, the Siberian traps, the Parana, Karoo basalts, etc. So there's a lot of things that line up that tell you that maybe the impact craters on the moon may have been wrongly dated and they fit with the flood, not with creation.
Out like this.
Well, if it was slow and gradual, it would be like that. If rapidly, it downcuts. It's like a jet blast, a jet cutting through steel. It produces a nice clean cut. So if you've got water that's coming through at incredibly rapid rate, is producing what we call cavitation, which is where you get vacuum bubbles that implode, and it's like mini explosions blasting the rock to smithereens. Then it's going to be focused in the. You're going to have a point where the plateau, where the water rises and starts to erode through, and it's going to rapidly downcut, and of course the water coming in behind it is going to spread out, and successively, yes, you've got softer and harder layers. The harder layers are going to be more like this with cliffs. The softer layers are going to have the slopes, and so that's the typical profile. You see, if all the layers were of equal hardness, then yes, you'd tend to have a more sloping profile.
Pressure, though, is not, the pressure seems to not go down. The pressure is going forward. If you got a lake that breaks up, the pressure is going.
Yeah, but the fastest flow is a destructive flow is at the base. The interesting thing is most people don't realise that if you have a slurry, if you have a sediment slurry, it actually hugs the bottom of the water column. Okay, and it's important to recognise that, because Noah was in the ark with lots of water beneath him. Where the erosion and sedimentation was occurring was in the bottom part of the water column. And so the sediments, the slurry, because of its density, is bottom hugging. And it's the slurry with all the grains that are carving at the bottom, not at the top. Okay? And so for example, we learnt a lot. What was it, 1911, I think it was? There was an earthquake on the continental shelf of Nova Scotia, and it caused a slumping of sediments on the continental shelf, and it produced a turbidity current, which was a slurry that raced down the continental slope, continental shelf, across the continental shelf, and down the continental shelf into the deep ocean basin. And we knew that it travelled at a speed of 70 miles per hour because it successively broke the transatlantic communication cables from Canada to Europe. And they could time the break of each cable, and they knew when the current went past, and then they went in and investigated, and sure enough, they found the deposits. And you had no evidence of that occurring at the surface. It was all down close to the ocean floor. And that's why it's the bottom of the water coming through that you're going to get the the sediment and the vacuum bubbles with the cavity that do all the grinding work, not so much higher up. But that's an excellent question. And we need to do more investigations of that. That's the sort of things that we can do experiments with. And sometimes experiments are done for us. You know, when they had to have a rapid release of water, overflow, Lake Oroville, the last time it was full, there was had to be a rapid release, and it cut a mini canyon in the spillway, and off the escape spillway, diversion spillway. So, you know, the geologists are seeing these things. The same happened with Glen Canyon Dam. The water itself, the water was a cutting tool that cut through the concrete into the sandstone beneath the concrete in the overflow tubes.
There are YouTube videos on that.
Yes.
Like in a matter of minutes, right?
Correct.
Huge amounts of
And they knew something was wrong because there was all these vibrations going on that, and then it came out red. The water came out red at the bottom in the Colorado River. That to shut it down immediately because the whole dam was shaking. So that's why we need a new generation of many more researchers, and why it's important to have you know, a geology department at Cedarville University that teaches geology from a creationist and flood perspective, and a geology program at the Masters University in Santa Clarita, California, and so on. We need that. Yeah, it can be produced in the lab, and the engineers know about it, even concerned about it happening with propellers.
I can speak to that.
Yeah.
It's a huge issue. The science and engineering behind propellers, the curvature of them on every surface is very precise. And if you damage a propeller, like you hit a rock or a ground or hit a log, it will run off balance and create cavitation so quickly that it'll form pitting and bubbles all over the propeller, or even dissolve the entire propeller very rapidly, like in a transit.
You see that in pumps also. The pump impeller, if you
Exactly.
get the
Yes,
inlet head on the pump, and that water covering the pump inlet, and it'll get cavitation inside, and it'll just
So the engineers knew more about it before the geologists discovered it.
Yeah, but then even the propeller, like, never mind damage. If there's just a slight flaw in it, so that when the propeller is turning, it creates, how do I describe this? Like a vacuum, sort of. It flashes bubbles on the surface of the propeller and turns the water into vapor because it lowers the pressure. It'll eat a hole right through the propeller very quickly. And we're talking 30-foot propellers, giant propellers.
Yep.
And small ones. Oh, I can tell you about it. I'm sure they see plenty of cavitation on the props.
Yep. Gary.
So a few years ago, I had an opportunity to visit the Copper Canyon in Mexico. It has the slanted sides, even though it's got the depth of the Grand Canyon. Any research been done there that you're aware of? In terms
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay.
I can speak to that. The geotechnical people study the rock to determine whether it'll fail, and that's called a step back. So the reason inside a mine that's got steps is they ultimately want a slope that is greater than, or not as steep as a failure slope. Otherwise, we've heard of Bingham Canyon that he mentioned.
Hey, Dennis, all louder over here.
Okay, the slopes inside of a mine are step-back slopes, so that the ultimate slope, if you kind of forget that it's steps, but to draw a line through that, that slope has to be such that it will not fail. And the geotech tells them whether it'll stand up, which is so strange how these are standing up perfectly like they are, because geotechnically, they shouldn't be standing up like that. You can't come in here and mine, because what he mentioned about that conchoidal fracturing, the same sort of thing can happen in a mine. If you
try to make the wall too steep, it just collapses above. And you've seen it. You see it on the beach. You go stand on the beach there, and it's pretty steep. And you put some pressure on the top, and it just fails. So a mine inside has to constantly be stepping inside. So that's what we call waste and strip ratio. Here's your deposit you want, but it's under this much material. So you got to start clear out there, tearing all that stuff off to get down to the bottom, to the cherry in the bottom. Because otherwise you're going to have slope failure. You have people down in there, and here comes the slope and buries them all and kills them. So it's all a geotechnical thing, which is so strange that we can geotechnically have this wall standing here for millions of years, no less.
Millions of years. That's the key thing.
I saw a documentary. They were talking about like the Great Lakes flooded and the glacier, and it just came rushing through here. It was another flood theory.
No, that was Glacial Lake Missoula. So up by Missoula in Montana, there was the glaciers came down, and the debris that formed as the glaciers retreated, you had a big lake of water develop there. Down to the west of that, you have the Columbia River basalts, very hard rock, and for years, in the Columbia River basalts, you've got the channeled scablands, which are huge gorges and including dry waterfalls. And there was a lot of argument over how they were formed. And a guy by the name of J. Harlan Bretz, early in the 1915, 1920, he proposed that there'd been a dam break of that lake, up the glacial lake up by Missoula, and a lot of water, a little bit of time, had carved out the channeled scablands, and he had provided lots of evidence for it. He was alienated, and he was criticised and alienated by the geological community for 30 years, until they finally caught up with him and they agreed with him. And in the 1960s, he was awarded, before he died, the Penrose Medal by the US Geological Society of America. It's their highest honour. So, yeah. And so there's been more of these recognised. You'll get the same effect in Iceland, where you'll get a volcano erupting under the ice, will melt the ice, and there'll be a sudden outbreak of water, and it forms a huge, massive erosion event. It's called a Jökulhlaup, I think it's called. I don't know the Norwegian or the Icelandic pronunciation, but it's a glacial outburst flood. So more and more of these are being recognised. Of course, the Great Lakes were carved out by glaciers, by the ice sheets, the Great Lakes.
Ice sheets.
Yeah.
Well, that Mount St. Helens.
Mud flow that came through, carved out a bitty Grand Canyon. What does that look like?
That's another example. After the eruption of Mount St. Helens, the initial eruption, there were subsequent eruptions, and there was a big snowpack had developed when there was an eruption. And in March 1982, that eruption and the mud with the snow melting to ice formed a slurry that came down the sides of Mount St. Helens, cut canyons hundreds of feet deep in a matter of hours, and cut through all the previous debris in the Toutle River drainage area, and carved out a 1/40th scale model of the Grand Canyon, with the meanders and everything, with the steep walls as well, not sloping walls. and and that was in a matter of a day. So there's lots of examples from smaller events that we've witnessed that illustrate this is all feasible. And as with the dam breach, it was very interesting that Steve Austin wrote a paper on the spillover erosion of Grand Canyon, which we published in 2021 in our Answers Research Journal. The same year, we published that late in the year. In July of that year, there was a paper published in a secular journal by 6 or 8 geologists, I think it was 8, that also proposed, and they actually they had built a flume tank experiment to replicate simulate the catastrophic release of breakdown of Hopi Lake, and replicate it on mini scale the Grand Canyon. So, it's not just creationists that are talking about the carving out of the Grand Canyon rapidly.
At Mount St. Helens, where this rapid gorge was formed with the vertical sides, since then, what has happened to those sides? Are they caving in? Are they?
No, they're essentially still standing up, even though some of the sediment is still softish. Those walls have stood up. And you can see footage that's been taken in that movie, the Is Genesis History movie. There's footage there. That was filmed. The footage was taken for that about 2015. And what's that? That's 30 years after the carving of that canyon. It's still the walls are still standing up.
Are they hard?
The material is hardened, yes, a lot, not completely. It's still, you can break it down fairly easily, but it's still firm. What's on the menu tonight?
Spaghetti.
I thought it would be. It was the only thing that they normally have that we hadn't already had, so I predicted it was spaghetti.